what I hope I can offer to all of you, as Paul just outlined, is a perspective on what the heck is happening in this town and why it matters to you, how politics over the next 2+ years, I say that because we're in political season now leading up to the 2018 elections, but we are also very much in the presidential campaign season leading up to the 2020 elections as well. And why it matters to you, what you should worry about. So let me start with a few things to think about. One, we are in an incredibly unpredictable time as it relates to policymaking. So I say that it doesn't matter if you like President Trump or you don't like President Trump. It is an unpredictable policymaking process going on from the White House and being driven by the administration. We don't know what to think. Even people predicting here in Washington who do this for a living don't always know. The second piece to think about and take into account is the uncertainty of who is going to be in charge. So there is, of course, as I mentioned, the 2020 elections, and there'll be probably 50 candidates running on the Democratic side, give or take a dozen or so. I always say 50, but it may actually be about 24. Before that even happens, we have the 2018 elections. We have questions about who is going to lead each party, major divisions within each party, and all of that has an impact on what policies are put forward and where the emphasis will be in terms of the party's leadership. The third piece I would just put on your radar as I begin my talk here is just the fact that politics is going to drive policymaking. Right now, people are thinking about their own survival, whether it is a candidate for congressional office, a candidate for Senate. What happened in 2016 has thrown things up into an unknown world, and that is impacting people on both sides of the aisle. So let me start with the uncertainty of who exactly is going to be in charge. First, let me admit, like almost everybody in Washington, I predicted that Hillary Clinton would win in a landslide in the primary and the general election. I was wrong on both accounts. I was not alone, but I was very wrong. What I can assure you of is that that outcome has prompted many people, analysts, or members of the media to rethink how things are covered. There is a clear disconnect going on, still is, but there's been efforts to improve it, between what's happening here, what's happening sometimes on the coast, and what's happening in communities around the country, what people are dealing with in their communities, whether it's job losses, changes in economic opportunity, and there really has been a disconnect on that front. So I just like to put that out there as I make predictions that I have been wrong before, but I've been thoughtful about where I have been wrong. So 2018, now if you pay attention to purely the headlines in newspapers, national newspapers, you will think that this is about whether or not the Socialist Democratic Party is going to take over the country. And I say that because there was a recent primary election in New York, Queens and the Bronx, it covered. My mother is actually from this district, so I kind of relate to the changes that have happened there. But in this district, you had a 6'5" Irish guy, Joe Crowley, who's been in Congress forever, nobody thought was remotely vulnerable, be defeated by a 28-year-old Latino woman who was very energetic, engaging, defeated him in the primary. She's a member of the Socialist Democratic Party. I use this example because what it has rushed people to conclude is that the Democratic Party is moving in the direction of socialism. That is not the case, I can assure you. But this case was an example of the division of the parties, and it shows sort of what each party is dealing with. The reality is, for the 2018 elections happening in November, most of the races and the determination of who is going to control the Congress are going to be around districts that are middle of the road, districts where there are moderates fighting moderates, where there is a battle over some of the core central issues that many people are dealing with every day, but it is not a battle of the extremes. And we saw that about 2 weeks ago in a primary election, or sorry, a special election that happened in Ohio that was much more reflective of what's happening in the country and why people are predicting that Democrats will win the House in November. There was a race in Ohio. I will say that neither of the candidates was a political rock star. Neither of them are going to be leading the country anytime soon. However, they were reflective of the positions of each of their parties. This is a district where Mitt Romney and Donald Trump had won by double digits. It had never been a district on the radar of any Democrats or political prognosticators or the media, but all of a sudden you have this pretty young guy who is challenging the Republican candidate, and he came within 1,000 votes of defeating him. Now, is that because he's such a better candidate? No. Is that because the Democratic positioning is so much better, perceived as better than the Republican positioning in that district? No, it's not. It still is a very Republican-leaning district. However, there's a lot of energy on the Democratic side, and that's something that Republicans in congressional races are struggling to capture and struggling to find. But many of the districts and the races that are being fought between now and November will be races like that. So what are people predicting? I would predict, most people are predicting, Democrats win the House, Republicans maintain control of the Senate. Obviously, Trump will still be in the White House, so you have a split party, split candidate, or split control of Congress. Now, in that same race I mentioned, the special election, one of the most interesting things to watch in congressional races is how money is spent. Because money is, that's putting money behind something, as I don't have to tell this room, of course, means you think that's the most powerful message. In this particular race, it started out in the beginning that the Republican candidate was running a race that was pretty traditional. It was running on pro-tax reform messages up on television and in paid media, running from a position of defending the accomplishments of the current administration. And the Democrat was running on traditional Democratic stances on health care and economic growth and tax cuts for the middle class, et cetera. As it got to the end and the race got closer and closer, the Republican candidates started running ads about how the Democrat would be close friends with Nancy Pelosi, how the Democrat would be pretty much bringing Nancy Pelosi to this conservative district and bringing liberal progressive values to a not liberal progressive district. The Democrat in the race had to say he would not vote for Nancy Pelosi if she was running for Speaker, and he is not alone. There are dozens of candidates who have said that. I use this example because Nancy Pelosi's been the leader of the Democratic Party in Congress and in the House for 16 years. She's a fighter, she's tough, she is an arm twister behind the scenes. Healthcare wouldn't be law without her. That has a mixed brand of emotions and responses from people depending on how you feel about healthcare. She's tough. She's probably never been more at risk of losing her leadership position than she is now. She's also on the verge of potentially becoming Speaker of the House again. The reason this is relevant to all of you is because if she's not Speaker or she's not leader, then who is? And how does that impact issues ranging from where investigations go to how issues like taxes are dealt with? That matters because a lot of it is driven from the Speaker and the leaders of the party. It could go a couple of different ways on the Democratic side. On one hand, if the Democrats win back the House, you have a number of, as I mentioned before, probably more moderate members. A lot of them have said they won't vote for Pelosi. Do they field someone? Maybe, but you're not going to have a Speaker who was just elected. Certainly possible. Do you have a movement from the more liberal progressive side? You certainly could. It's hard to see how a coalition is put together. My odds would be that Nancy Pelosi remains the leader, but you just never know. She also is somebody, as much as she has been this label of being very liberal and out of touch with the country, she also is a political animal. And what that means is she's going to make decisions that are in the interests of a broad swath of the Democratic Party, whereas a lot of leaders would not. So when it comes to an issue, which I know can be the elephant in the room sometimes, but I'll just introduce it now, of impeachment. Nancy Pelosi does not want to have an impeachment battle. That is not good politics for the Democrats, surprisingly. I would say surprisingly to some people who are calling for it. There will be a push for that. If she's not speaker, she's not leader, you may have somebody who makes that a primary issue they run on. So let me just touch on the Republican side and leadership on the Republican side. Paul Ryan's retiring. Retiring is sort of a funny word because he's very young, so who knows what he will do next. But he will no longer be in Congress. As a result, you're going to have a new leader on the Republican side as well. Any way you cut it, you will have a new Speaker of the House, which is more impactful than you think because there's not clear leaders in the parties right now. The candidates talked about most frequently are Kevin McCarthy, who is probably in the same vein of Paul Ryan, although not as focused on entitlement cuts, so who knows how that would come up. And then you have Steve Scalise, Jim Jordan, some members who are more from the Freedom Caucus, more from the wing of the party. Now, where that goes and the direction that goes will matter too, because it will drive things like, do you need to look for more pay-fors? Do you need to find more ways to pay for the tax cut package? That could impact all of your businesses. Does it impacts things like, what do they do if the Mueller investigation comes out with a certain conclusion? So there are lots of ways that whoever is leader could impact the outcome. So I touched on my prediction of the House and where the House may go. The Senate is a different story, mainly because while 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election, most of the seats are tough seats for Democrats to defend. They're on borrowed time. Democrats should not be probably representing some of these states because they are not necessarily aligned entirely with the politics of the states. Possible Democrats could lose a seat or two there. If it's a huge wave election, they may maintain. I would be quite surprised if Democrats take control of the Senate. You never know. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that particular piece. Now, beyond the leadership question, which of course will drive the agenda, is the substantive question of what will happen over the next 2 years in Congress, and how will, of course, that impact all of you. So I worked for President Obama on and off for 8 years. What is true of almost every White House is the first 2 years is the most productive time, typically, first 2 years-ish, of policymaking. That's when you can get business done. That's when you can get big legislation through. We saw that for him with the health care bill. We saw that for President Trump with tax reform. So that's behind us. It doesn't mean that nothing will happen. Things will certainly happen, but the first 2 years are typically the most active. If we have a split control of Congress, it reminds me a little bit, maybe some of you are from homes like this, or maybe you are in a home like this. When I was growing up, my dad always voted for a Republican, no matter who was on the ticket, didn't matter. My mother always voted for a Democrat, didn't matter who was on the ticket. I distinctly remember my dad telling my mom she was the only person in the country who voted for Mondale, which I thought was strange at the time, but he wasn't that far from the truth. So it's similar to that in that, you cancel each other out. There are some exceptions to that, I would say, to watch out for. One is investigations. Now, if Democrats take control of the House, they also will have subpoena power, which means they have across-the-board subpoena power from many committees. So what receives most of the headlines is the issue of the Russia investigation and what happens there. And the Intelligence Committee and committees that have jurisdiction over the Russia investigation, that will receive most of the headlines. It will be dominant tickers on cable. There's no doubt about that. What I would encourage you to watch for, if Democrats win back the House, is subpoena power they use as it relates to other issues. So I mentioned that Nancy Pelosi, in my view, she would probably quell efforts by the progressive wing of her party to make an impeachment push if the House is won by the Democrats. I continue to believe that. Now, what would happen with that, even within parties, is there has to be, she'd have to give a pound of flesh on something else. Maybe one that she wouldn't have a problem with, but she has to give something to the progressives. So where does she get something from for the progressives? My bet is probably the EPA regulations, maybe HHS, healthcare regulations, or healthcare issues. And what they would do is they would use subpoena power to have hearings, investigations, and look into actions that have happened over the last 2 years when the other party has been in power. What happens, how does that impact all of you? How does that impact Washington? It brings a lot of business to a halt, because what the focus of agencies becomes is on preparing for testimony, on lawyers and meeting with lawyers and preparing for determining whether or not they should testify, preparing for responses to questions from the investigatory bodies. So it ends up taking, it's not uncommon, both parties do this to each other, but this would be a big time-consuming, have a huge time-consuming impact on the business of Washington. On a more positive note, I should say, one of the other pieces that I think you can watch out for more action on, but maybe not the action you all think, is on taxes. Now, if Republicans maintain control of the House and Senate, they will no doubt want to do more and go further on the tax reform package that they passed. There are things they've talked about doing, indexing of capital gains, further simplifying the rates, that they may look to do. If Kevin McCarthy follows the trend of Paul Ryan, he may want to do, or whoever is the leader, I should say, they may want to do something on entitlements to have more of a pay-for to cover additional cuts with the tax code. On the Democratic side, there's a couple of options. You have disagreement, I should say, between the House and Senate about what they want to happen. The Senate has put forward a package of things that is not surprising and things Democrats have talked about for a long time. Closing loopholes, raising the rates on the highest income, addressing the AMT, et cetera. There is not entirely an agreement between the Senate leaders and the House leaders about what they want to do. So Richie Neal would be the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and he is more of a moderate. He is not from the progressive wing of the party. He's a Democrat, but he's not from the progressive wing of the party. So what does that mean? There are things I think he'd want to address. There are pieces of the tax code that I think people on both parties, or even with the new reform bill, think may not be exactly working. I'm sure they'll do hearings and things along those lines. But ultimately, Democrats really want to address SALT, the state and local taxes deductibility issue. It's a huge political issue for Democrats because there's so many members from the coasts, and because the leadership is from a lot of the states that are impacted. They want to figure out a way to address that. So that may mean that they would be willing to negotiate on some issues in the tax package that Republicans may want. Maybe they make some of the tax cuts permanent. Maybe they address some simplification issues. Ultimately, just as I was talking about how Nancy Pelosi is going to try to keep everybody on the same plane, Democratic leadership does not want to repeal the tax bill. They may say they do. I understand many people will say they do. There will be what we call message votes, which means votes to repeal things that you know won't pass, but you want to be able to say that you voted for it. That is certainly the case. But they don't want to run on a platform of raising taxes, especially not on the middle class. That's too easy for the other side to run on. And if you look back at healthcare and how the healthcare battle has worked over the course of 10 years, it was very, very unpopular in the beginning. But what has made it more popular is because now it's about taking something away. And the longer a policy is in place, you don't want to, if the middle class feels if they feel they're impacted and they're getting a tax cut, you don't want to then raise their taxes, obviously. Too easy to run on. So I think there is opportunity there. We'll see. Compromise can be a dirty word in election years, especially in a town like Washington. But that's another area that I would certainly watch out for. So once we get past 2018, 2020 is next on the horizon, of course, or it's already on the horizon. I've worked on 3 presidential campaigns. I can tell you that staff is already being hired. There are offices already being reserved. There are many, many people running for president or think they're running for president on the Democratic side, and I think many, not including the current president, who think they may run on the Republican side. So it should be a wild ride. I encourage you all to buckle up to the degree you pay attention to that aspect of politics. But this is really whereas the 2018 election was about the middle, or will be about the middle, the 2020 election, especially the primary, is about the extremes, the extreme wings of the parties. And that's because the primary process is so long in our country that both members on both sides of the aisle end up being pushed through the process to the most extreme wings of their own party. So let me use a few examples. You know, if you start with Bernie Sanders, for example, who ran in 2016, nobody thought he had a chance. This is a guy who Democrats would say, well, he's not even a registered Democrat, as if anybody actually cares about that sort of thing, but that's a big talking point in this town. He was seen as sort of ruffled and not somebody who was a great public speaker, but at the same time, he moved a lot of people in the party to support him. He excited millennials. He got energy going around his candidacy. He talked about economic issues in a way that people could relate to. And he was hugely impactful on the primary process. He was hugely underestimated also by the Democratic establishment. Most people probably didn't pay attention to this, but the former chairwoman of the Democratic Party actually lost her job over Bernie Sanders and putting the finger of the DNC on the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. When I was working at the White House in 2016, and it was the near end of the primary, and we didn't take Bernie Sanders particularly seriously either. All of a sudden, he was creating this movement. But I remember very clearly the day that he came to visit. He had a meeting with President Obama, and it was right before the primary process ended. So I was responsible for arranging the meeting and making sure he and his staff had everything they needed. And you know, you're typically used to a formality when it comes to that. People bring a dozen staff, that's fine, we can accommodate that. They have certain requests, no problem. His campaign manager, who was a very nice guy, but on his voicemail was a message about the comic book store that he was maybe continuing to run, I'm not sure, which tells you something quite interesting, right? Now, the day that Senator Sanders was coming to the White House, we were all ready, we had the press was very interested in how this would all go and what would happen. President Obama, who was very much on time always, was ready and waiting in his office, and we're looking at the clock, and it's 1 o'clock, and he's supposed to be there, he's not there, it's 1:05, he's not there, it's 1:10, and we're thinking, what's going on, what's happening? It turns out that on the way to the White House, Bernie Sanders decided he'd like a scone and a cup of coffee. So he stopped at Pete's coffee shop, got himself a scone and a cup of coffee. Now, we always, of course, said, we have scones and coffee here, just tell us what you need, we can get you a scone and some coffee. But I share that story because some people think, oh, he was, trying to tell the president that he had to wait for him. I think that's a little harsh. My bet is that he's just a bit of a normal guy, and he's going to have a meeting with President Obama. Okay, I need a snack and some coffee first. He brought only, I think, 2 staffers with him. Now, on the other side, you have President Trump, who, when he was running, was hugely underestimated by his own party. He made the establishment, still makes the establishment very, very uncomfortable. He's not a traditional Republican in the Chamber of Commerce sense. He is anti-trade. I mean, these are things you all know, but he's anti-immigration. He's not for globalization. These are standard bearer positions of the Republican Party that he did not embrace when he was running and still hasn't embraced. And throughout the primary process, well, very different from Bernie Sanders, there was this belief that if we just wait it out more, he will go away. I remember when Scott Walker announced he was no longer going to run for president, he gave the reasoning as that he was going to coalesce the party around a candidate who was not Donald Trump. Obviously, that didn't happen. Maybe he overthought his power, perhaps, but that hasn't happened. You know, he is also from a wing of the party. Now, what Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both did is energize a part of the party that was pretty sleepy for a while. When Donald Trump came to the White House, he came 2 days after the election. We were in sort of shell shock about the outcome, but of course, he's the next president. We're inviting him and anyone he'd like to bring to the White House. He showed up at the White House not with 20 staffers, which is what normally would happen with almost anyone else. Hillary Clinton may have brought 50. I mean, who knows? He showed up with 2 people, his son-in-law and his spokesperson. That's it, to the White House. He walked around the White House and he was questioning why there wasn't any open workspaces. It's a very old building, I mean, that's why, but there wasn't any kind of open working stations as you might have in a normal business or an office building. He also asked President Obama repeatedly who was good on the team and who might stay, which is sort of endearing in some way, but you know, obviously it's a political staff. He was going to hire his own political staff. But that reminded me a bit of Bernie Sanders in a weird way, and that these are sort of not abnormal questions. These are questions people would ask who weren't of the ways of Washington for many, many years. So Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, obviously, I don't think they'd have a meal together. I don't know, that would sort of be interesting, but it would be Alec Baldwin and Larry David. Those are the voices I would hear in my head. But you know, what they do have in common, aside from being unconventional, of course, which they certainly both are, they both ran in part on a platform of being anti-trade. Now, trade has traditionally, historically, been more popular than unpopular in the country. You don't always feel that way if you listen to kind of the debates of interest groups in Washington, but more popular than unpopular, even as recently as 2016 when we were working to get TPP and Trade Promotion Authority through Congress, or 2015 it was. That changed in 2016. So Donald Trump ran on a platform that was not just anti-trade, but anti the entire global trading system, anti-WTO, anti-NAFTA, anti-alliances on the economic front in some ways. That changed. He pushed his party. He pushed the direction of his primary. He also pushed the direction of the general election and the debate on that front. Now think about this. Hillary Clinton was the architect of TPP. She helped negotiate it. She gave countless speeches talking about the benefits to American business, American economy. She came out in opposition to her own trade deal at the end of the general election process because it had become so politically unpopular. That tells you a lot about how that issue has moved. So how does that impact you? Well, I know trade is a big issue for all of you, many of your businesses, and naturally it is. It impacts businesses and industries across the country. It also impacts you because trade and negotiating trade deals, as Donald Trump has promised to do, and there are signs or even reporting that maybe there could be some development on NAFTA. I guess we'll see. It's very hard. And I say that not to be overly simplistic, but when I came into the White House in 2009, the commitment, the South Korea trade deal, had been signed by President Bush 2 years prior. We didn't finalize it for 2 more years. It takes time, it's difficult. You need to have something to give the other side, you need leverage. It's not clear what that is in some of these areas. So in order to satisfy the base of people who support President Trump, the people who think, that's right, being anti-trade means fighting for workers, it means fighting for, fighting against the countries and the establishment that is trying to do us harm, he needs something to go to, and tariffs has become that political thing. So you've seen, there have been a couple of times you could almost chart some of this out. When things are tough politically, there's an announcement on tariffs. I mean, the week that he announced the recent round on China was the same week that his former campaign manager had his trial start. So it's a throwing meat to the 30 to 35% of people that support him hardcore, that want to be with him, that, in my view, will probably stick with him. On the other side of the aisle, you have a similar issue. When people talk about the 50 candidates or so who may run, you have Bernie Sanders, you have people who are trying to go to the left of Bernie Sanders on issues like this, and many of them are going to try to adjust their positioning so that they can also be seen as pro-worker, pro-middle class. That's a tough place to be if you are pro-trade. I am pro-trade, a pro-free trader, and it is a tough place to be. It has become a very unpopular issue. On tariffs, we've seen several announcements. Somebody asked me the other day what the likelihood I thought of the implementation of the next round of tariffs on China. I can predict, with an educated guess, that it will happen unless something stops it. So what could stop it? Maybe some behind-the-scenes negotiating. I'll get to that in a second. But right now, being anti-trade and being pro-tariff, and I know that doesn't totally make sense on a policy front, has become synonymous in the public digestion with being pro-worker. One of the questions that people often ask me is, well, don't people understand that tariffs and putting these tariffs in place could have a huge impact on a lot of the industries and communities that elected Donald Trump? There are many parts of the country that where the businesses, take the agriculture industry, would be hugely impacted. Yes, absolutely. If you were thinking with your head about this, a lot of those industries will be impacted. A lot of the communities that elected and supported Donald Trump will be hugely impacted, could be hugely impacted by the tariffs. So what's going on? A couple things. The decision that, well, one, they're not all fully implemented, so people may not be feeling it quite yet. On the agriculture industry front, and you all may have theories about this that I look forward to discussing, it may be that the bailout, which is preemptively put out there, which tells you a lot about the belief of the impact, may be helping ease some of the concern or pain about it. But you see a lot of farmers and people from the agriculture industry interviewed, and they say, we're with him, we know he's trying to do the right thing. And so there's this belief that this is fighting for their industries or fighting for workers in a way that kind of seems to take the play or overwhelm the issue of what the actual economic impact may be on these particular issues. The other thing that we're seeing is that on the Democratic side, if you're going to pure politics about this issue, this is not an issue of tariffs and putting them in place that is registering on people's radar. It's not registering for average Democrats across the country who are going to vote in a midterm election as an issue they're concerned about. It doesn't come up in focus groups, which is when pollsters are meeting with a group of individuals and interviewing them. It doesn't come up in broad polls. There are other issues that take precedent over this that are driving the vote, driving Democrats' participation in the process. So therefore, you really have no huge opposition out there. You have opposition, actually, of many members of Congress. You have opposition of many trade organizations and institutional organizations. But there isn't a loud, rising voice in the country and communities about the impact of these tariffs. And that is having an impact because all people are seeing and hearing is the President of the United States talking about the benefit of it, and you're not seeing it on the other side. So that also means that there's no paid media that's being spent, no money being spent explaining how tariffs could be impacted or impactful by political candidates. That often drives conversations. And that means nobody's paying attention to it. That could all change, but right now, if I were to give you a prediction, I would say that there's more tariffs to probably come down the road, that as the political season heats up and President Trump is running for re-election next year, which any president would start that early, or he's already sort of started, that this is a safe place to go. It's a place where he can satisfy his base, where he can announce something that will give people a piece of meat to bite into. So I don't think I have to convince any of you that what happens on a lot of these issues isn't just a domestic issue, it's also a global international issue, because we are not operating, obviously, in our own stratosphere here in the United States. What we do impacts other countries, impacts other businesses, and impacts their decision-making, impacts kind of how they react to us. So this is important as it relates to tariffs and trade as well, of course, given the United States for many decades, if not more, and there are certainly exceptions to this, has been a pretty predictable global leader. People know what we're going to say at meetings. We are pro-alliance. We are pro-freedom of speech. We are supportive of our allies and partners who have been many of the same allies and partners since World War II. There are predictable components of who we are. That has been thrown into a different confusion, I should say, with our typical partners around the world. There are positive and negative impacts of that I will get into, but for an issue like this, what it means is that if you are the leader of Canada, funny, I can't believe I'm saying that, or you're a European leader, you want to be close partners with the United States. You care about the resources we can offer, not just economically or trade deals with us, but you care about every component of our relationship. You care about our contributions to NATO. You care about us coming to your defense, potentially. You care about the role we've played in conflicts around the world and our military power. All of these things come into play. At the same time, you need to prepare for the potential that you could be shot at. I don't mean physically, I don't mean actually with military equipment. I mean that you could be targeted, surprisingly, with tariffs or economic issues that would put at risk your own economy and change your own decision making. So it's like the old phrase goes: "Fool me once, shame on me. Shame on you. Fool me once, shame on me." All of these countries, I don't know why I have a hard time with that, all of these countries are preparing for the potential that something that, even though they've been a long-time ally or partner of the United States, that they could be targeted with tariffs, they could be targeted with some of these tools that we've seen coming from this administration. The last thing I'll just say on this, and I know I'm going to wrap up and then we're going to do questions here, is that there are positives and negatives to this. It's not all negative. On the positive side, the unpredictability means that we're not the country that everybody thinks we can be relied on for financial contributions, military contributions, many of the things we've done for decades. That can have some benefit. We've seen, while China has certainly taken a number of retaliatory actions, there are also areas where there's been some speculation that they might make some positive moves on issues like market access. Is that a direct result of threats from this administration? I don't know. Maybe it could be. You could speculate. There are areas on the more military front. I worked in the Obama administration when we didn't strike Syria. That was a disappointment to many people, even who had been longtime staffers of President Obama. We did strike Syria when more chemical weapons use was done, so it shows we followed through. But ultimately, the big risk here globally is that there's a lack of communication, and there could be a miscommunication that could have a devastating impact. The military one is the most obvious one. If you're threatening, we're going to strike North Korea, which fortunately we're not threatening as much anymore, it is possible that the crazy leader of North Korea could take that the wrong way. That's not a risk we've had for some time. It is also possible, there also isn't a typical process that has gone through in this administration for how international decision-making is made. So, on the question of could this be de-escalated, I think It could be. It wouldn't happen at the top level because it never does. But it could happen at the cabinet level, and there's certainly many cabinet members who would like to reduce the tensions and get out of these trade wars. The problem is it's a whack-a-mole. They don't know. There isn't a typical consultative process, the historic consultative process happening leading up to it. So they are also not sure how to predict what is going to happen. So before I get to questions, let me just leave you with a few things to take away with all of you. One is there's going to be change of leadership in Congress at the top. No matter what party wins, that will have an impact on not just policy making, but what Washington spends its time on. Second is tariffs and trade, being anti-trade, remain very good politics. How will that change? My belief is there would have to be a movement in communities, maybe led by business leaders who don't like to be outspoken for good reason about the impact of these in order for the perception of it to possibly change. Third is I think there could be some developments on taxes that won't be terrible, that could involve compromise. We'll see. Hope springs eternal. But that is a positive area of opportunity, I think. And then fourth area to watch is, each party is having their own identity crisis right now. And you're going to see some rises and ups and downs of whether the moderates or the extreme sides of each party is going to win out. Where that goes is going to have a huge impact on policymaking in this town for quite some time. So I would certainly watch that. Well, with that, let me have a conversation with all of you and take any questions you have. Anyone? Anything you'd like to ask? I will try my best to predict. Go ahead. You want to predict a new Speaker of the House? Oh, a new Speaker of the House. I think it will be Nancy Pelosi. What do you think? I'm a Democrat. I think my bio says that. But I'm more saying that, so I'm not trying to hide that, but I'm more saying that, putting that aside, where I think it's going, because just of some of the trends you've seen out in the country. And because I've seen her twist elbows and seen her build a coalition, and it's very hard to see how anyone else can do that. On the Republican side, I think probably Kevin McCarthy. He's got a close relationship with Trump. But he also is seen as very digestible by many elements of the party. So that's my bet, though you never know. Crazy things could happen. But what do you think?
I think there's a chance, though, that she would take over with almost like sunset clause, like an option to, I'll take over, but I'll relinquish it.
Maybe. Now, there's an interesting theory. This is getting into the weeds, but I think we're there. Is that if she does not look like she can pull the coalition together, that Steny Hoyer may run with a sunset clause. And he's somebody who has been there for a long time. He's in the same age bracket as Nancy Pelosi. He's considered more moderate. And maybe he would run and sort of give a wink that he would do it for 2 years and bring in somebody from the younger generation. The younger generation push is what will drive a lot of the movement, at least on the Democratic side. We'll see. We could take bets. I don't know. Go ahead.
So, as a White House, former White House communications director, your job, watershed, has been control the message and craft the message. In this current White House, has challenged. Do you think that's changed forever? Will that ever come back? And do you think that the relationship with the press will remain as fractured as it seems to be? Like our press is now playing son.
Right.
How do you think the long-term effects of these both communications in the White House and relationships with the press?
So in case people couldn't hear him, what Paul was asking is, about the White House's relationship with the press and about how communications happens. And is it changed forever, or could it go back? So it depends in part on whether you think President Trump is an anomaly or not. Is there just one President Trump and he's this unique figure who was elected, but the person who follows him will be different? It depends on who you talk to. I am of the belief there are aspects of him that are an anomaly. He's a unique figure. Whether you like him or not, which I'll just keep saying, you know, he is a marketing genius in many ways. I mean, he got himself elected president of the United States. There are many factors we could certainly go into a rabbit hole on, but I won't, on what impacted that. But he did tap into something in the country. So the challenge, I think, with the person who's had my job, or there's been like 7 of them, I think, over the past 2 years, is that he is the communications director. He is the press secretary. There's no one else who is doing those jobs. It doesn't mean that the people who have served in them are unqualified or can't do the job. But if you don't have that relationship with your boss, or that expectation that you're going to make a lot of the decisions for them, including how you message and communicate, then it's really impossible to do your job. I do think that changes, because I don't think that most people who run for president or will be elected will operate exactly like that. It's really not to their advantage. So what else? What, did I answer your question?
Well, the second part was the media. And the media has changed in how they've covered politics.
So what I've experienced, and I actually, many of you may have experienced version of this as well, the biggest change in my job or my industry has of course been the rise of technology and the just expansion of media options out there. That has been extremely difficult to digest by the more traditional media outlets, no surprise. So I remember I did a panel with a columnist from the Washington Post maybe 2 years ago, and she said, well, the biggest mistake the Obama administration made was that they never did an interview with the Washington Post, which is very self-referential. And what I said to her, and I really like this columnist, but I said, I think the challenge with that is that the reach of the Washington Post is about, you know, 1/100th the size of some of the people who have made themselves stars on YouTube. So I use that example because, you know, as a communications director, you're not thinking about, you shouldn't be thinking about how to check the box of I did this with ABC, I did this with the Washington Post, whatever the media is that's driving your industry. You want to think about how to reach the people that you're trying to reach, how to meet people where they are. We did a lot of different things. Trump has done a lot of different things. I think that will continue in terms of trying to engage with different types of media. But I think the old model of, which many network correspondents are used to, of I'm from ABC, I get every 5th interview, I think is completely out the window, and it's going to be impacted by people's reach and impact and how they're able to engage with target audiences. Oh, go ahead in the back.
What's being done to improve polling and the accuracy of polling?
So this is an excellent question. What is being done to improve polling and the accuracy of polling? Not enough. Someone asked me the other day, or the other night, do I think polls are accurate? No, I don't. I think we've seen from most recent elections that they are not accurate. You can get interesting information from focus groups and from interview type of polling, but broad swath polling is really tough. I mean, it's not as effective for obvious reasons. People no longer have landlines. They're hard to reach on their cell phones. Obviously, information gathered over the internet is not accurate. I think, you know, I'm not a pollster, so there's probably some scientific data-driven answer to this, like smaller sample sizes or kind of how you represent the swath of the country. But honestly, I think it just can't be relied on as much for the touch and the analysis of what's happening around the country and what's happening in a community. I mean, every poll said Hillary Clinton was going to win. You know, she won the popular vote, but that she was going to win a lot of the states she didn't win. There were clearly problems with the models, but the other problem was the campaign, she never visited Wisconsin, right? I mean, people weren't talking to people on the ground, so there's a human element of this that I think probably needs to be reintroduced in a way by candidates and campaigns, and is to some degree, and not rely as much on the data. But there are probably some scientific answers to it. You or others may know the answer to. Go ahead.
It seems like, or it doesn't seem like, Trump draws all the fire, all the light, sucks all the air out of the room. Who in his administration is taking advantage of that to get things they want to get done, like Kavanaugh seems like he's going to pass very easily
Yeah.
now because it's not a concern. Is
Sure.
Stephen Miller taking advantage of that? Is Mnuchin taking it? You know, not that it's a Trump strategy,
Yeah.
but it's a byproduct that a lot of things are happening no one hears about.
So when you say taking advantage of it, can you just tell me a little bit more about what you mean? Like getting policies through, or?
I think getting policies through, or, you know, I think the EPA before Pruitt, you know, did certain things. People aren't paying attention, and I don't think it's a Donald
Get credit, you mean get credit?
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a Trump strategy, but I think many of his advisors have said, hey, while all this noise is going on here, let's do this.
Sure. So let me know if I'm answering your question in the way you're asking it. There is an argument that a lot of people make that I can understand, which is the economy is doing pretty well right now. I mean, you can argue there's a bubble, when will it break, all of that. But right now there's a pretty good economic story. How much of it Trump should be credited with, there's also argument about that. But why aren't they talking about that? And why isn't that the driving narrative that he's going out and they're all going out to communicate and convey and use that as a point of leverage? Is that what you're asking? Or a different question?
I think it's more of the Wizard of Oz, you know, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain because, you know, Trump's out there sucking all the coverage.
Yeah, look, I think ultimately the problem is that he's the communications director, and while they may have the best laid plans to have a multi-week push on infrastructure or an issue that they want to get passed or want to move forward that they can build a coalition on in Congress, and many Democrats would have a hard time not supporting, you know, they may wake up at 6:15 in the morning and there may be a tweet about Roseanne Barr. I mean, who knows? And that's, I think, a big challenge in trying to not just communicate, but that impacts, I think, is what you're leading to, how they can also get additional business done, because they need to not just build coalitions here, which is a lot of behind the scenes, but build coalitions out in the country. And there's a messiness to that process because it's being interrupted by the person who's sitting in the Oval Office.
Because of technology and the internet, you started your comments by saying there's obviously much more of a disconnect than we thought.
Yeah.
So with technology and the internet and the influence of special interest and talking points, is it more of a talking point, special interest, diversion to create disconnect, or is it a real disconnect?
I think it's a real disconnect driven by the crutch of technology, because for a lot of people running for office, they look back at how people have successfully driven political movements, and a lot of it has happened online, through fundraising or through gathering support, things along those lines. If you look at the 2016 race, Trump had some very specific points he used to message on that were supported and applauded by his core supporters, but people knew him as, you know, he wants to build a wall, he thinks he's going to rip up trade agreements, he's going to rip up the Iran agreement, etc. It was very clear messaging. I don't think it was polling driven. I think it was driven by his gut. On the other side, you had a reliance on, and we were guilty of this in the White House and campaigns as well, so it wasn't just Hillary Clinton's campaign, but a reliance on data to the point where it was dissecting information and who you were communicating it with and what you were exactly saying. It was so diffuse that you had no idea why she was running and what she was running for. And we did a focus group after the election in 2016, and one of the outcomes of that was people would say, you know, one of the questions was, what do Republicans stand for? And it was, you know, they have a lot of money and they're lowering our taxes. I think it was something like that. And what do Democrats stand for? And it was a big question mark by a lot of respondents. And part of that was because we're trying to communicate with the disabled community about disabilities and what we're going to do on disabilities. We're trying to communicate with, you know, millennials about millennial issues, when ultimately there needs to be a core driving narrative about who you are and what you stand for and what you're running for, and we sort of lost the thread on that. And I think some of that's driven by data and polling. Oh, go ahead.
So, national politics aside, sort of impact local level while all this attention is on national politics?
Sure. Well, I think the question I'd pose back to you is what are you trying to achieve?
Just, you know, the betterment of the, you know, business community and citizens at the state and local level.
Sure. So let me use tariffs as an example because I know that it's impacted a lot of people. I fully understand why, you know, if you're in a position like any of you, you don't want to get into partisan politics because your customers and people you work with are from all spectrums. I think that is true of probably almost everybody in the business community with some exceptions. I think a challenge is that part of the reason there's not a voice talking about the economic impact and the impact on job loss and the impact on communities of tariffs is because of that issue. That is tough. I can't, you know, if I were all of you, I know I would grapple with that. But I think you need to find a way to talk about the impact without being political. Some of that is data. But what I have found is that it can't just be data. It can't just be you'd lose 100 jobs here, because it's sort of like, what does that mean? It has to be more about the people and faces and locations. And so I think at a state and local level, if you're trying to impact change, you need to gather and be able to tell that story. I don't think it needs to be in a partisan way. It doesn't have to be trashing Trump or trashing Nancy Pelosi, especially coming from the private sector. It can be, this is the unintended impact of these policies. I'm really concerned about where this is going. I just talked to Sally Luhu, who runs you know, she's a supplier, and she's not going to be able to run her business. That's going to impact people in her community in this way. So gathering some of those stories, being able to tell them, being able to communicate in not an overly aggressive political way, I think is what I would think about on an issue like that if I were you. I know it's a beautiful day out, so don't feel, but I'm happy to also talk. Go ahead.
So I want to follow up on a question that my colleague Chuck asked you. And this is on maybe unintended consequences of what's going on with Trump, but I'm interested in your perspective as a communicator. And the question is, what effect is the whole Trump sucking the air having on what businesses are doing in strategy and what they might be trying to get away with that they might otherwise not? And I'll give you an example. A couple of months ago, a very unusual thing happened. You're a new mother. A stroller company by the name of Britax.
Familiar with it.
had a stroller that the Consumer Product Safety Commission told them to recall, and they said no. And so the CPSC sued them. This is very, very, very unusual. So at a major product safety conference a couple of months ago, I queried some of the most well-known product safety attorneys in the country, and all of them were scratching their heads and said they never, ever, ever would have recommended to their client that they take that risk, that they take that hit, and especially with such a well-known brand name. But now, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to one of those attorneys, and he said, you know, our whole strategy has changed because Trump dominates the news so much that nobody cared. And it had almost no effect. So I'm not exactly sure if that's what you were getting at, Chuck, but and I can tell you that this very prominent product safety attorney is changing his advice of what he's telling clients as a result of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting example. It kind of goes back to the question of, is this the new normal or is this an anomaly, right? And we don't know, it could be 2 years, it could be 6 years. You know, if I were giving advice to a political elected official, I would say, get your scandal out on a day where there's a bigger scandal probably, which is probably Communications 101. The example in business may be similar to what you just said. I don't know what this is what you were asking, but as you were talking, it made me think of this question of a lot of times businesses calculate. Do they sit on committee or boards that the government is putting together? Is it good to get in with certain people or be close to the president or not? Now I would say I would stay away, primarily because you don't want to be in the eye. You don't want to be a company that is named by Trump. You could tell me that your view is different, that it would help you or it hurt you, but it's so polarizing right now that unless you have customers who are completely on one side of the aisle or another, which I doubt you do, it becomes an issue that I think could have a larger impact, less of a benefit than saying I'm chairing the export committee or whatever it may be. So that's sort of the advice I would give, is just to run the business, keep your head down. But the example you gave is an interesting one. I guess if you're in business with the government and they sue you, there are bigger scandals to be worried about. That is true. I hope none of you are dealing with that issue at any point in time. But it's an interesting point about this particular time we're in.
Do we have any other questions? If not, I have this badge, so I'm going to take the last two. So you worked in the White House with the first and only African-American president. How much did that fact dominate the messaging that came out of the White House? Was it a factor after the election? And how did Obama feel about that himself?
Sure. Now, this is really interesting because I think what I saw up close were a lot of different things about President Obama, but one of them was certainly about how he was dealing with the pressure of, bringing the country together around racial relations. Now, I am a white woman. I am not dealing with the challenges that many minority communities have dealt with, so let me put that, of course, out there, but I did see him grapple with this, and one of the ways I saw it was, and if anybody's interested in this particular question, there's a very interesting piece that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote for The Atlantic post-election that would have turned out differently had the outcome turned out differently. I remember when President Obama was asked to speak after the shooting at the church in South Carolina. And he was asked to, often asked when there was a racially driven tragedy, to give remarks and give a eulogy. And the challenge in those situations was there was this expectation that he was going to heal everybody through the process. And he felt that pressure. When the reality is a speech is not going to, of course, do that. And his feeling was that, you had to, it wasn't him actually. He was only going to be off at a certain time. It had to be discussions and interactions in communities. And I remember that development of that speech because we sat with him in the Oval Office and said, well, what do you want to say? What do you think you can say? What stories can we tell? And he said, do I have to speak? And it wasn't because he was tired and annoyed. I mean, obviously it's a tragedy. It was because the pressure of trying to figure out how you can heal a racially charged tragedy and heal a divided country on racial issues was, he didn't know how he could meet that. Now that also ended up being the speech in the day where he gave a speech, which nobody remembers that much, but he sang Amazing Grace in the middle of the speech. And I think in the moment, he didn't really know what else to do, but he was moved by the emotions in the room. Now the story that I referenced by Ta-Nehisi Coates is interesting because what I think we found post-election and how he was feeling about it was that people were surprised that the country had not been, that equality was not universal. That was an outcome, that, oh, look, there's racism in the country. Of course there's racism in the country. We've known that. He wasn't healing that as the first African-American president. But he felt a sadness that maybe, there are many reasons that the election turned out as it did, but that some of the racially hinged comments that were made, that it didn't matter to people, and that wasn't a factor. So ultimately at the end, I think he felt a sadness, and still does, and about whether he met the expectation that people had that he would bridge the racial divide in the country. And obviously no one person could do that no matter what their background is.
Great. Second question, on Sunday, and again, I know in talking to some of my colleagues, we're trying to poke in and get some information that might be confidential, and you're really good about not doing that. So I'm going to pose it a different way.
Sure.
Give us a story like where you came home from work and got in front of your husband and said, you cannot believe the crap that went on today, or you cannot believe what I had to deal with today. What would be one of those situations where you just couldn't believe you were part of that history?
Sure. Interesting. So I've been thinking about this because I didn't have a very good answer the other day, and I was like, there's so many things that happen, you try to think of a funny, compelling story. You know, this is not a, there were many days where I would come home and say, you will not believe what happened today, or the chain of events. I talked a little bit the other day about the day that we got the hostages out of Iran. And in instances like that, you can't tell your spouse about what's going on, but you're mysteriously disappeared for 3 days and you're not on your cell phone because you're watching what's happening. So there are certainly moments like that. Though one of the moments with President Obama, and it's a personal one, that I think whether you like his politics or don't like his politics tells you a lot about who he is as a person. When I was at the State Department, when I went back to the White House, I was still at the State Department, and I was about 6 months pregnant when they called me and said, do you want to come back and be the White House communications director? And you know, I talked to the chief of staff at the time about it and a couple of other people in there, and I thought, I can't do this. I mean, I'm about to have a baby. This is too much. It's too much stress. And you know, next thing I know, next day comes, my phone rings in my office, and it's like, we're going to connect you with the president. So I get on the phone with him, and he says, which is such a funny thing, I always remember this part, the king is in the outside of my office, so I only have a minute. He means the king of Jordan, which I was like, even if I don't take this job, this is a funny memory to have. But you know, I just want to tell you that whatever your needs are for having a baby, the best thing that's ever happened to me is the birth of my 2 daughters. And whatever your needs are, we'll arrange them. And I spent about 10 minutes, so sorry, King Abdullah, on the phone with him talking about childcare options, which you could work from home, you could do this, you can leave at 5:30, all these things. So, you know, I came home and told my husband about that and said, I have to do this job, basically. Was that a moment where we were making history and solving crises? No, there were many of those, some that we did better than others, but that's a moment that I think tells you about who he is and what his priorities are.
Well, terrific. Jen, thank you so much for
you.
sharing with us.